Hey y'all, welcome back. In our last video this week, we are going to talk about fragments. Now, as I mentioned in the video before this and in the first video, fragments is a topic that was requested by the Industry Advisory Council, the people who are going to pay you someday, as well as it's considered best practice by Google to do everything with fragments. At first, I'm going to warn you, it is going to seem like a completely unnecessary abstraction layer that is just causing a lot more complication. That's only feeling that way because with a simple application, it kind of is. But real applications are not going to be as simple as what we're going to be doing for these first, 4, 5, 6 weeks worth of assignments. They're going to be vastly more complicated, and fragments will become absolutely critical to maintainable, usable code that won't make you want to gouge your own eyes out with a ice pick. So, lest you be stuck in misery land, we got to be comfortable with fragments. So, this video we're going to begin introducing the basics of a fragment, and as I mentioned in the very first video this week, fragments are designed to allow us to create a flexible user interface. Fragments allow us to encapsulate logic and UI together into one reusable piece, much the way that classes allow us to create reusable pieces. Fragments are going to do that same thing, but now coupling the idea of bringing user interface into that idea on a more macro scale. So fragments are going to be an important thing. Now, before we start writing a little bit of code, I want to bring back this fragment lifecycle that we saw in the first video this week. There are a lot of lifecycle events in a fragment, much more so than an activity. And I'll tell you, you don't always need every individual activity or lifecycle event. At a minimum, you will usually almost always use onCreate view, and onPause. Okay. Now, if you're going to have communication from this fragment to any other entity beyond, outside of itself, then you will also always use onAttach, because that's what's going to make that communication take place. And we'll learn how to do that starting next week. But at a bare minimum, we're going to need create view, and pause. And then you'll add in the others as needed for whatever it is you're trying to do. Sometimes, you might need an onResume or an onStart as well. But again, it'll couple together depending on what you need to have happen. But a safe minimums are going to be the create view, and the pause. Okay? Now, fragments themselves are super easy to create. Okay? So we're going to come in here to our application and create a fragment. Now, the easiest way is to right-click on App, and we are going to choose New. Now, will give us an opportunity to make tons of new things, from Java classes to Kotlin files to images and vectors to singleton patterns to other activities and folders and services. I mean, all the cool things happen here, but what we want to come to is fragment. And for this fragment, we want to choose just a blank fragment. Okay? Now, the name blank fragment is kind of stupid. You want to name your fragments and start thinking now ahead of time how you're going to organize your code. And give them a name that makes sense. I like to, for example, prefix my fragments with the name fragment. I name it backwards to the way that some other developers do it, because then when I'm looking at my code, all my fragments are grouped together in my code and in my layouts. It's very common that the fragment layouts are grouped together, but I like to see my code grouped together. So oftentimes will do things like this. The downside, though, is the automated layout tools automatically prepend fragment. So when I put the word fragment at the beginning, it gets a little confused. So this is how I'm going to name things this semester. If you prefer to name it demo fragment instead, I don't care. Okay, but it gets the base idea. Now, before you get excited and push finish, okay, and if you've already pushed finish, go ahead and Control Z and remake a fragment. Okay, we need to make sure we uncheck these two boxes right here where it says include fragment factory methods and include interface callbacks. Right now, they will throw an immense amount of boiler code that is just going to confuse the daylights out of you. So we don't want fragment factory methods or interface callbacks right now. In fact, A lot of the times we'll just write some of that boilerplate ourselves because it's a lot faster and a lot easier than dealing with the template stuff that will dump in. But that's coming in weeks later. So for now, uncheck both of those boxes. We're in Java, targeting main. Go ahead and push finish. Okay, now a couple of important things to note here when it comes to working with fragments. First off is when you drop them in, it's not uncommon that everything is going to go red like this, meaning I don't know where it is. If it's red and you've still got your Gradle build running, don't panic. That's because it's still recompiling everything, and you got to just give it a little bit of time. Okay. Now, when we look at the fragment, see everything went black, which means sweet, it worked out. It now knows what a fragment is. It's done. Okay. But in fragments, I want to point your attention to something right here. Oops, the right button here. Okay. Notice with this fragment, our import statement. Okay, we are importing specifically the support v4 app fragment. Okay. Now, lest you think, oh well, I'm targeting a new OS, I don't need the support library. Okay. That's actually wrong. Best practice with Google is to use the support library for all of this. While fragments did become native in applications long before API 21, Google has asked everybody to still use the support library for because that's where they're going to add the new features to Fragment. They've basically abandoned android.app.fragment. So you should be using android.support.v4.app.fragment. And that's actually coming directly from an Android team member that I met back at Google I/O back in May as I was talking with them, and as part of some presentations as well that you're welcome to go watch on your own. They talked about the need to use the support library. Now that will cause you a little bit of trickiness sometimes because by default often it'll want to import the non-support library, and we have to make sure we're using the support library all the way through in our imports. Okay. Generally when you make a fragment, it'll get it right. It's later on when we go to use fragments in our activity that it'll often want to bring in non-support library classes. And we'll talk about those, and I'll show you some of those stumbling blocks to be aware of as we go forward with the video today and throughout the rest of the semester. But that's the first thing we need to just remember with fragments is we need to make sure we are in the support library to work with them. Okay? As we mentioned, by default, we've got an empty constructor, and we must always, notice it says required empty public constructor. We always have to have at least a public empty constructor that the fragment manager can use if it has to reconstruct our fragment for some reason. And we'll deal with that later on. By default, it will always create an onCreate view for us because that will go ahead and inflate the XML that we gave it as well. But it doesn't notice have our onCreate or onPause. Now, I want to take just a minute and show you how to implement some of those. Okay, we could go through by hand and type in the signatures for those, but I don't know about you guys. I hate memorizing stupid little things like that. So we're going to use Android Studio to make our lives a little bit better. If we right-click, we can choose Generate and Override Methods. And now we can come in and choose and say, you know what, I need an onCreate. And we find the necessary onCreate here. And there it is hiding right here, onCreate. Okay. Or if we want to do an Generate again, Override on pause. Now you can do multiples of these, for example, by control clicking, okay, if you want as well, on pause. So we're not going to do anything really with those right now for this first fragment because we don't really need it. We're just bringing in the ideas of fragments, but so that you know how to create those later on as we go. Because really the goal of this assignment is to get us to start to see what a fragment is, define some fragments, and get them in main activities. We're not going to really make the fragments do anything until next week. We're going to slowly build this thing a layer at a time, starting with some of the core concepts of Android, and then we'll continue to build out from there. So while this first one is going to be really simple, it's going to continue to snowball from there. So you need to make sure you are comfortable with these foundational principles as we start the beginning of this class, so that as we get out, you're not stuck wasting extra time or lost because you missed something that happened earlier on. Okay, so right now we have a fragment that has a view, and if we go to that view for the fragment, again, we can come directly to the layout, or we can click the little icon to take us straight to the layout. Okay. By default, it is made of a frame layout. Now we need to take a minute and talk about what a frame layout is. A frame layout is a very powerful layout. However, frame layouts are designed to only contain one thing. Okay, now this is important. Frame layouts can only hold one thing. Fragments often need to consist of multiple UI pieces. So frame layouts are great containers to hold a fragment, but the fragments 99% of the time need to have a root other than frame layout. For example, linear layout. A frame layout, it can hold one thing. That one thing can be another layout. So for example, the frame layout holds one other thing that's a linear layout, and that linear layout can hold 1,000 things. That frame layout is still only holding one. Okay? So for example, if I were to try to take this frame layout and copy and paste and drop another text view right here, it's not going to work. It's going to blow up because frame layouts can only have one view. In fact, the application would crash because we're not allowed to have two things inside of a frame layout. So a lot of the times when we come into these, we are, again, 99% of the time, we're going to change that to a linear layout or a constraint layout or something else that meets the needs of your application. Okay? Now, I'm going to leave this guy to matching the parent and matching the height because we're going to control the heights and widths and the sizes of the fragment itself inside the activity that's going to hold the fragment. So I want the fragment to go ahead and take all of the size, but let the main activity define how much space the fragment will have available to it. Okay. Now, what that means now is we need a place to put our fragment. Okay. So if we look, for example, at your homework assignment this week, and we look at one of the initial stages, we need to have 1, 2, 3, 4 fragments plus 4 buttons, okay, that are all going to come together. So what we need is we need a place to put a fragment here for fragment A. We'll need a place for B, C, and D. And then you'll need to nest some layouts to make those things happen. And you're going to have to think about those layout nesting a little bit to make it happen. I don't want to give you the solution to that. I want you to think through these processes because, again, that's when this is really going to cement and you will be successful somewhere out on your own in the industry because that's what I care about more than anything else. But let's say we first off want to have this guy, this fragment A. Okay? He's going to take the whole width of the screen, but just a limited piece of the vertical space. Then we'll have some vertical space here and some vertical space here, obviously. But the thing we need is inside of our main activity, which is this whole screen space here, is I need a place that's dedicated for my fragment in that layout. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually put a frame layout in the place where we want our fragment to be. Okay? So it allows us to nest. If you think about the main activity, okay, we have the linear layout for our main activity, which then will contain our frame layout, which then contains, inside the frame layout, whatever we put for our fragment. Wow. You really miss my fancy pen when I have to write with a mouse on the screen. It's kind of hard. Okay? Linear layout contains a frame layout, right? And then down here we're going to have nesting of some more linear layouts till eventually we get to a frame layout to represent, each, fragment. Those are really terrible stars. Why is that so much harder to do with a mouse? Have you ever tried that? That sucks. Anyways, total squirrel. Sorry, guys. Let's focus in on this guy, okay? Let's get within our linear layout that we had for this whole thing, let's put a frame layout and target loading the fragment, okay? Oops. Come back, Android Studio. There we go. Okay. So what we're going to do is inside our linear layout at the top, we're going to get rid of this hello world crap because we don't need any of those pieces. Let's make them all go away. Now what we need instead is a frame layout. Sorry, I smacked the microphone there. For our space. Now for the width of this frame layout, I want it to take the entire width of the screen, as you can see in that screenshot. But I want my height to only be a portion of that. Okay, and I'll let you guys figure out the ratios you want to do for those things, because again, you're going to want to use 0 DP and layout weights, right? So I'm just going to put a layout weight of 1 for now. It'll take the whole screen, but it'll give you the idea. Okay. Now, because I'm not going to define what's going inside this frame layout here, I'm going to just self-close this tag. Okay, I don't need to have a closer tag. That just makes it a little cleaner. You don't have to do it that way. Okay, but, and here is the critical piece. Okay, I need to be able to load something inside of this layout at runtime. I need to be able to manipulate it from code. So, I talked about this in the last video. What do we need here that will allow us to find and target this guy in code? If you said ID, you are correct. We need to create an ID for our frame layout, right? So let's call this frag A container. Okay, because this is what we'll put fragment A in. All right. So now I have somewhere to put my fragment. So now what I need to do is I need to get some code that will allow me to wire these guys up together. Okay. So let's go into my main activity where I'm setting this layout right here, and it'll create a frame layout, but that's as far as it's going to go. Instead, I need to put that fragment in place. Now, it is possible to embed the fragment directly into code, and we'll talk about that upcoming, but since you're going to need to manipulate this on the fly, you know, for example, when the user clicks a button to make a fragment go into place, we're going to do all of them in code for this first assignment. Now, the way this works is we need a fragment manager. Okay, notice there are two. They recently, in this version of Android Studio that came out like 4 weeks ago, they finally have deprecated Android.app like I talked about, but make sure you're in the support library version, okay, when you import it, because if you don't get the support version, it will make your life a living nightmare for a while, okay? And eventually, the support.v4 and v7s and all that crap is going to go away. That was the worst package naming scheme and Google could have made. In fact, at I/O, they made fun of themselves quite a bit for that. They're switching to a new tool called Android Jetpack that's going to use an Android X bundle. If you try to run some of the beta or canary versions of Android, it will try to push you to some of those, which will then, again, because that code is changing substantially, make yourself a little bit harder. So I recommend we get into this version of Android Studio and don't touch it. Okay, the worst thing you can do, and every Android developer in the world will tell you the same thing, is update your IDE or your SDKs in the middle of app development, because everything will change. Google loves change. It's like what they thrive on, even if it makes your life a nightmare. So we're going to leave things alone now that we've got them updated. Okay, even though it'll come up and say, hey, I've got this cool update for you, resist the urge. Okay, so we have a fragment manager. I'm going to call this guy FM for my fragment manager, and the way we get it is by making a request to get the support fragment manager. There's a different method we could call this as get fragment manager we would use if we were using a non-support library, but because we're using the support library, we're going to say give me the support library's fragment manager. Okay, and with my fragment manager now I can begin a transaction. Okay, and this transaction is going to allow us to chain a whole bunch of things together. So and then be able to roll them back as necessary. For example, if we add it to the back stack, the user can press the back button and unwind it. If I don't add it to the back stack, then that piece will not be unwindable. Okay, so begin transaction. The first thing we want to do in this transaction is we want to replace. Now, a replace means take whatever is the content of this container and replace it with my fragment. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean replace it with some fragment with another fragment. We're talking about the layout pieces. So the thing that's holding this, the ID I'm going to give you on where to put this, take whatever content is there, replace it. If you don't do a replace, you do an add, it will just keep stacking them on top of each other, which will then, you'll see that in a couple of weeks, will create some problems for us. We really need to make sure we're using replaces. Okay, now we're going to give it the ID. We access IDs via the IDs and other things via the R class. Okay, this is automatically generated by Google or by Android Studio. Don't ever touch the R class. We just use the R class. So R, then we tell it what resource we're looking for. That's what it stands for. I want the IDs, so give me the ID, and we called this ID frag A container. Okay, that's our first of 3 required attributes. 2 arguments, I should say, to our replace method. First is the container. Where am I putting this crap? Second is the fragment I'm going to put there. Now we can, in this case, this makes sense, just construct a new fragment, okay, which we called fragment demo. Okay. If you have a reference to it somewhere else, you can certainly pass in some reference to something else you've already constructed, which sometimes is useful when you need to ship data to that fragment, okay, via arguments, which you would bundle together. You don't just actually pass them in the constructor. That would cause you problems later on. Then the last thing we want to do is we want to give it a string here at the end. We call this string a tag. It'll enable us to find the fragment later on when we need to replace it or change it, and vice versa. Okay, or to get a reference back to it after it's on screen, I should say. And let's just call this guy container A. Right? And that's just a string. So we replace it. Now, if we want the user to be able to unwind this behavior when they press the back button, okay, then we would add to backstack passing a null value here. Okay, and then lastly, we do a commit. If I don't want them to be able to send this back, undo by the backstack, then I just don't put this statement in. Okay. So it makes sense, for example, like things that are my initial setup. If we come back to this image we had, fragment A, for example, probably shouldn't be undoable, but loading 2 and 3 and 4, or switching 3 and 4, I probably want to be able to hit the back button and have those unwind. Okay, so for this fragment A guy, I'm going to leave it off. But that's what shows you how to do that later on. Okay, so this will enable us to put a fragment in place. So let's go ahead and run this for just a second. I have to wait for the ADB bridge. Let's fire up a emulator. And while this emulator launches here, I'm going to pause for just a second so you guys don't have to stare at this Gradle build running. And it's done. Through the magic of television, that took 3 seconds for you and a full minute 7 seconds for me. Aren't you glad I didn't make you stare at the screen doing nothing for a full minute? I am. Okay, but as you can see, we have our fragment here, and if I hit the back button, it takes me out of the application. Or if we leave this add to backstack in place and we run our application instead, I'm going to check the box that says use the same selection for future launches, so it stops asking me every time I'm testing, because that gets really old really quickly. So we're going to let this build run again. And once it's done running, which that time only took a couple of seconds, we can see now our application has come back. But if I hit the back button, my fragment disappears, but the application stays open. If I hit the back again now, I'm back to the point where the application will close. So you can see the functionality of what add to backstack will do for you. Okay. So, the other thing I want you guys to see how to be able to do, because you're going to need this for loading your fragments, okay? And as far as setting those colors, they don't have to be those exact same shades, for example, that I have in this image too. Let me just note that. You can pick a green and a blue and an orange or a red that you like. Pick a shade that you're happy with, and assign that background color. Now, in this class, you're going to find I'm going to leave some things out as little challenges for you, because you need to be able to get comfortable with finding information on your own, especially. So I'm going to let you find this piece in the documentation on how to set those colors. It's very, very easy. In fact, you may not even have to look it up in the documentation if you think about it a little bit. But I'll let you guys do that piece. The last thing I want to show you in this video, though, is how do we put a button here and make this button, for example, load another fragment in a different container. Okay? So, if I'm going to need another fragment, let's go ahead and create a new fragment, blank fragment, and let's choose let's call this guy fragment B. Okay? Again, because I'm OCD, I can't stand the names like that. You could leave them like that. They technically wouldn't hurt anything. It's just annoying. And we're going to hit finish. I have another fragment here that just does nothing but put in a piece of text. In fact, if you can see it, it says hello blank fragment. We could change this to say fragment 2, for example, or B, or whatever. right? Okay, now as I mentioned in the first week though, never ever hard-coded text in any submission to me. Can leave that hard-coded text. Always extract that out. That is a big thing industries ask me to stress. So if I see hard-coded text, I will instantly dock you points. The amount of points will depend on a lot of different factors, and you'll see that. So let's just not even do it, and then you won't even find out how hard that can be sometimes. So we're going to leave that. We're going to extract that text out. Again, fragment. We're going to change this guy to a linear layout. And now in our main activity, coming back to this layout, we are now going to make another frame layout to hold this guy. And this width, I'm going to set this guy to 0 dp because I don't want it to be the full width here. And my height, let's make my height 200 density pixels tall. Get rid of that and need a weight. And let's call this weight 3. Okay, and we need a ID. Let's call this guy frag B container. What are you complaining about? Alright, you know, actually let's just make this guy 200 for just the demonstration purposes here. Let's go like this and let's run. Okay, so now we've got a fragment B container, a fragment A container. Now we need to wire it all together. But this fragment B container, I only want to put in if somebody clicks a button. Okay, so let's drop a button into place, and let's make it width and height wrap content. Let's give it an ID. Oops, ID, not if. BTN's a common one you'll see for button. Button load frag 2. And let's give it some text. Load fragment 2. And then we will immediately extract it. You can hit Alt-Enter as a shortcut if you want. Extract resource. Boom. Done. Just like that. So now what we need to do though is get a reference to this button load and handle when the user presses it. Because right now we can see that shows up. Ooh, that's fun. Screw that crap. Okay. We need to get this button here and load it up. So in our main activity, in our onCreate method again, we are now going to come in here and we need to get a reference to this button. So we need a variable to hold it. Let's make sure we import that guy in. Button load 2 equals. Now, let me type this code out and then I'll explain what it means. Oopsie. Okay. There we go. Now, we're going to get a button. We're going to store it in a variable. And we're going to get this button by using findViewById, which is a method that allows us to search the as part of an activity, for example, or any view that contains it that we can then search by ID, the ID we passed it, and get a reference to that guy. Okay. Now, you'll sometimes get a warning in here, for example, that this cast is redundant. Okay, that's only true starting with Android API 26. So this depends on the compiler version that you're using. It's still a good practice to leave those casts in place, and it probably will for a little while yet. But these casts are required by the compiler when we're compiling against anything below API 26, so 25 and below. If our compiler is 26, 27, or 28 right now, which are the 3 actives, or more as they come on, then that cast is unnecessary. It does not hurt anything to leave it there. So as industry is asked, we're going to leave that there for this semester so that you guys are still using those in case you're compiling against older APIs. Okay. That doesn't mean minimum target of API, it means compiler version. When you compile against those lower ones, you have to have it because that's a compiler level change. Okay, so but we have our button. So button load 2. We need to set on click listener. New. Okay, the way that I got that all to show up there, let me do that again. Okay, if I start typing new, I hit Control Space to bring up the code completion window, and I get view.onClickListener. Okay, creating an anonymous class. Okay, Android loves anonymous classes. Okay, this is an anonymous class because there is no class definition. You know, we're creating a class definition on the fly. Okay. But inside of this view click listener, in this on click method, whatever we want to have happen, whenever that button is pressed, we will put here. Now that could be a call to a different method inside of the scope of this guy, or I can just put the implementation. Since we're going to be using this fragment manager more frequently, it might be a little bit easier, instead of having him FM be up there, let's make a private fragment manager. Okay, that way once we set him once, up here we can now use him again later on. So fragment manager, begin transaction. Inside this transaction we are going to replace r.id.frag b container with a new fragment b, and let's call this guy container b. And this one, because it was loaded with a button, we probably should add it to the backstack so the user can undo it, and then we will commit it. Now, you can chain as many of these replaces together as you want. So if I had several replaces I need to have happen, you know, say I was loading 3 or 4 different fragments at once, or 2, I would use multiple replaces for each of those. That way they undo with one button click, because it was one button that did it. Does it, you know, hopefully that makes sense. I almost asked, does that make sense? Like you guys can respond in video form. It doesn't really work the same way as I'm waving my hands around and pointing at things on the screen. Y'all can't see that either. Okay, and also again as a reminder, I don't type this S:. That is generated by, as a hint, by the IDE, so I can remember what the argument was that I passed. Okay. So now if we run this demo again, okay, we let our Gradle build run here. We should be able to now see the fragment A will be loaded when the application opens, and when I press the button, the second fragment should load up. Yeah. There we go. And we can load our fragment, and there he is. Okay? We can now load fragments. If I hit unwind, he goes away. If I hit it again, the whole application goes, because I didn't add to backstack on fragment A. I only added to backstack with fragment B. Okay? Hopefully if that makes sense. As always, if something is confusing, you're stuck, make sure to use the discussion forums. We'll all help each other out. I check into those things. You know, most every day, if not every day, for certainly every other day during the week. Maybe not as frequently on the weekends. So let's make sure we can help each other out if you get stuck. Otherwise, we'll see you guys online.